family. Welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. So some of you might have seen already that Joe Biden had put forth some new executive orders that are supposed to be basically a race equity package. And it's been basically put forth as his first step towards going forward with his promises to the Black community and, of course, to other communities, because nothing is ever exclusively done for the Black community in the United States.
The moment it arrived as a nation where we face deep racial inequities in America and systemic racism that has plagued our nation for far, far too long. I said that over the course of the past year that the blinders have been taken off the nation, the American people. What many Americans didn't see or had simply refused to see couldn't be ignored any longer. Those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that took George Floyd's life opened the eyes of millions of Americans and millions of people around all over the world. It was the knee on the neck of justice, and it wouldn't be forgotten. It stirred the conscience and of tens of millions of Americans. And in my view, it marked a turning point in this country's attitude toward racial justice.
Now, the reason I wanted to cover this is because I think it provides some very helpful context for those of us who might believe inside of the democratic machine as a means to an end when it comes to the subjugation of Africans in the United States. What I mean is that when you look at the conditions that our people are going through and have always gone through, remember, there has never been a day in American history where our people have not been the most subjugated, the most exploited, the ones who have been at the literal bottom of the economic food chain. There's never been a day where that reality has not existed in the United States of America. And despite all of this being the case, we still are inside of a situation where we have people who think that the legislative process that provides surface level reforms is going to be the ultimate salvation of our people. I would challenge my people who think that way to start imagining differently. Start talking more critically about what has happened and what actually needs to happen. Because if you understand the dire needs of the Black community, surface level reforms, surface level executive orders, surface level laws mean nothing to you. So let's just go through the executive orders that were released just very briefly, because I think, again, it's a very good example of what has always happened in American history. So we have a number of things that were released through President Biden. The first one that is on this list, and I will put the link to this site in the description, it's labeled as Redressing Our Nation and Federal Government's History of Discriminatory Housing Practices and Policies, that they will acknowledge the federal government's role in discriminatory practices like redlining and direct HUD to fully implement the Fair Housing Act, which requires the government to fight housing discrimination. Of course, the question is, why was the Fair Housing Act never fully implemented when this law has been here for decades? And what does it take to actually implement a law that is the law of the land? I remember seeing an interview with Malcolm X. He discussed the fact that these laws are passed and we're told to put our faith inside of these laws. And yet the same government that issued the laws doesn't even take the authority to implement.
No. So, as I said before, the legislation won't solve our problem. New York City has all of the laws. It has FETC, and still there's job discrimination in this city. Laws doesn't solve that type of law hasn't solved the problem. And it's the same with education. It's the same with the segregated educational system. It exists here the same as it exists in the South. Now, the law here is on the side of an integrated school system, but you still don't have an integrated school system.
So if you think about it like that, what purpose is the law for our people when it comes to our emancipation from this system? Well, it becomes meaningless, really. But this is being put forth as one of the reforms. Another one says, in order to reform the country's incarceration system by ending the use of private prisons, in action in line with what Biden proposed during his campaign for president. It says, according to the administration, private prison profiteer off of federal prisons in less safe conditions for prisoners and correctional officers alike. The order instructs the Department of Justice to not renew any contracts with privately operated criminal detention facilities. So this is another law that I would describe as very surface level for a number of reasons. One, we know that yes, there are private prisons. We know private prisons tend to be worse than public prisons for whatever reason. These private companies, of course, whenever you put capitalism inside of things that are already exploitative, it's always going to take it to the next level. And that's literally what's happened inside of our prison system. But the other thing for us to consider, though, is that federal prisons, or federal inmates in prisons rather, only encompass less than 10% of the prison population. I've seen figures that says 6% of the prison population. I've seen figures that say maybe 9, but definitely less than 10%. So what that means is that this law will literally only affect a very, very small pool of people, and therefore there's nothing revolutionary about it. The other thing, of course, is that the issue is mass incarceration, not just private incarceration. And of course, just saying that we're going to now house the federal inmates in federal prisons does nothing to change the nature of mass incarceration. So again, you have a picture painted for you, a very surface level law. Let's go to the next one. So it says a memo that repudiates racism and xenophobia towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, particularly amid the coronavirus pandemic. Throughout the pandemic, Asian Americans have been the victims of racist attacks, which have been scapegoated, and they have been stereotyped as people who created and spread the coronavirus. Trump helped spur these reactions by using racist language to describe the virus. Biden's memo directs the Department of Health and Human Services to issue guidance around cultural competency in the government's coronavirus response. Biden's memo also encourages the Department of Justice to partner with the AAPI to work to prevent discrimination and hate crimes. The thing that I will note about this, obviously, if you have not noted, there have been a lot of xenophobia coming from the Trump administration, but particularly targeted at Asian Americans. And this is something that's undeniable. But how easy is it to issue guidance when it comes to this issue, as opposed to the other victims of the coronavirus who have actually had their lives completely devastated? I would say many have been killed, not just by the coronavirus, but really by the white supremacist system that enables things like a coronavirus to completely devastate Black communities. And I'm talking about the fact that the coronavirus has affected Africans worse than any other group in the United States. You have more of us dying, more of us are losing our jobs, more of us are losing our businesses, more of us can't go and take care of our children, more of us are just completely destabilized from this pandemic more than any other group. So let's look to another article that was actually sent to me by one of you, and it was about the fact that a COVID-19 relief fund, a relief fund that was actually proposed, was going to be for only Black residents. Okay, that's something that's very rare, right? We don't usually see laws that are particularly meant for Black residents. So this was in Oregon of all states, right? A state that you don't really associate with Black people. But after this law was proposed and put out there, the lawsuits came. So this is an article in the New York Times. The link will be in the description. I'm going to read just some parts of it. Black civic leaders in Oregon heard the alarm bells early in the pandemic. Data and anecdotes around the country suggested that the coronavirus was disproportionately killing Black people. Locally, Black business owners had begun fretting about their livelihoods, and the stay-at-home orders and the various other measures were put in place. Many did not have valuable homes they could tap for capital, and requests for government assistance had gone nowhere. After convening several virtual meetings, the civic leaders proposed a bold and novel solution to that state lawmakers had approved in July. The state earmarked $62 million of its $1.4 billion federal COVID-19 relief money to provide grants to Black residents, business owners, and community organizations enduring pandemic-related hardships, okay? So this is something that I would say is obviously admirable, given the fact that, again, the COVID-19 has affected Africans worse than any other group. So if you're not going to put out something that's going to specifically help the people who are worse off than anyone else, then obviously your sincerity in alleviating the problem equally is very much not real. So, but of course, in America, there's always a but. And this article says, but now, millions of dollars in grants are on hold after one Mexican American, two white business owners are suing, arguing that the fund for Black residents discriminated against them. So this is, of course, Typical, right? Now, the dispute of the legal skirmish in the nation's decades-long battle over affirmative action has come in a year which the pandemic historically exposed the socioeconomic health disparities that African Americans face. It has unfolded to against the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter movement, and with institutions across the United States, from corporations to city councils, acknowledging systemic racism and activists demanding that meaningful steps be taken to undo racial inequalities. Okay, now that sounds good. Let's look at some of these quotes that were actually stated from the plaintiffs in these lawsuits trying to stop this fund for Black people specifically going forward. One says, "It is like in the employment arena, going to apply for a job and seeing a sign on the employment office that says, 'No Asians needed to apply.'" This is what a guy, Mr. Blum, who is basically a big conservative activist, I guess you would say, who has gone against types of affirmative actions or anything basically that has specifically gone towards benefiting Africans specifically. He says, "Your race and your ethnicity should not be used to harm you in your life's endeavors," which is so crazy and ironic coming from a white man, because your race has literally been used to harm my people historically and currently. But to you, that's fine, because as long as it's not written out in law that, hey, these Black people are going to benefit from being the people who have been the brunt of this brutality, as long as things are very done abstractly and cannot be addressed directly, you're fine with continuing the situation as is. That's very telling. Obviously, it's white supremacist in nature. Now, also, though, it says Walter Leja, a plaintiff in one of the lawsuits, said that he might be on the verge of laying off some of his employees, and that he needs the extra relief money, so that's why he's suing. He's a 64-year-old white man, and he could not say whether historic discrimination put Black business owners at a disadvantage. But on a particular fund, he said, this was not warranted. So he says, I can't say whether or not historical discrimination has crippled the Black community, but what I will say is that I'm not okay with not being able to access this money. Again, telling. He says, it's discriminatory. It's locking up a bunch of funds that can only be used for Black businesses when there's been tons of other businesses out there that need access to those funds. It's not a white or Black thing. It's an everybody thing. Again, ridiculous for the same reasons as the previous statement I just went through. So this is, to me, a really good example of what happens whenever things are done that could have a real change for Black people. And this was only a law that was only going to give out $62 million to Black people. We know that does nothing to reverse the historic discrimination against our people, but we also know that it's a lot better than these symbolic gestures or putting out proclamations, putting out guidances. If anything, this is something that was actually going to set a precedent that, hey, we should actually do more to help African people. But when things like that happen, what happens inside of this democratic system? Well, you have people who are adversely, who feel that their interests are adverse to the interests of African people. And that has always been the case in America. There's never been a day where our interests have been thought to align with the interest of the majority. Now, you might say, well, why is that? That's because we're in a capitalist system. Everything is about competition. You see this man right here, a white man who has benefited from historical discrimination against Africans. And he says that he feels like he should have access to the same funds. Not because it's not that you're adversely affected by his privilege, but instead because you, as a person who is competing inside of the market, should not be given a privilege, even if you were the person who has been hurt by the market itself. This is all encouraged inside of the system because we are literally competing for our lives inside of the system. And then when the system was literally built up on the backs of your people, on the blood of your people, it's never going to serve you equitably. So we have one more example of what Joe Biden put out. And again, another surface level thing, not towards Africans. It says, and in order directing agencies to strengthen their communication with Native American tribes. Okay. And it says the United States has a history of not honoring its agreements with indigenous people. Okay. The memo could be the start to the federal government fulfilling its duties in helping reverse poverty and poor health conditions in Indian country. And the only thing I'll say about this one is that this should give African people a good lesson. If you do not know, if you're talking about political situation, we're probably most similarly positioned as the Native Americans. However, I would say that they benefit more than us too, because they have a level of organization that our people lack. But as far as what we've gone through, as far as what the government has done to us, we would say that we are similarly situated to them, if anyone else, right? And yet, even though they have been given all these privileges in the government, given all these laws, given all these things that said, we're going to give this to you, give that to you, the federal government hasn't honored it. And that becomes my last question to my people who believe in a democratic process. We heard about the Fair Housing Act. They said, we're just not going to try to implement this thing that has been on the books for decades. You look at Native Americans, there are people who have the laws to give them something that should lift them out of the position that they are in, but the federal government doesn't honor it. What makes you think that this system is going to do any more or any better for African people? And that's really what I'll end this video. So what are your guys' comments on these, I would say, surface level reforms? I will see you all in the next video. Hey family, this is Tierney Cherie. I'm here to make an announcement that I'm very, very excited to make. I'm excited because I really think this is something that is important for our people. Otherwise, I would not have devoted so much time and energy towards it. So I finished my first book, and the book title is Fostering False Identity, the Child Welfare System's Design of Social Control of the Black Family. Now, why is this book something that I think will be very important for our community? Well, number one, it's dealing with the system of white supremacy, particularly the way that the system has targeted our children. If you don't know, our children are literally our future. Without our children, we have no future. And so understand that the system is very crafty when figuring out what to derail first. And to me, it's no mistake that the system particularly went after the Black family. If you look at what happened whenever we were enslaved by this system, and continues to go after the Black family, continues to go after Black children, continues to try to villainize African parents. So for that, I wanted to particularly talk about this subject. Now, the other thing that the book will deal with is our African identities. Why is it that our African identities are a threat to this system? Why is it that whenever we want to identify ourselves as being African, we get so much drawback inside of the Black community? I think a lot of us are not aware of the history of assimilationist thought inside of our community, this idea that we have to be close to white in order to be accepted. And so that's another subject that we delve into in this book. So I'm hoping that anyone who is, obviously, if you're a parent, a Black parent, and you really want to understand why it is that these systems are going after your children, I encourage you to read this book. I hope that it will arm you with a lot of knowledge and a lot of foresight, not just about how to protect your own children, but how to organize in your community, because that's really the purpose of the book, is to say that we have to organize among ourselves in order to protect ourselves from this white supremacist system. And then obviously, if you're an organizer in general, this is something that I think is important for you to read, because like I said, this is a subject in the Black community that we just don't discuss enough. Child welfare is not something that is going to get enough attention. People, obviously, will organize them around other causes, but this is one that is really important that I feel like we have to pay more attention to.